1 and at verse 18. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. Now we saw last week the way in which Paul demonstrates Christ's preeminence over all creation. There's this phrase which he uses again and again in this chapter. He used it 4 times in these 2 verses we were looking at last week, verses 16 and 17. All things, all things, all things, all things, all things. We saw 4 things last week actually as well. We saw that Christ was before all things. We see that in the beginning of verse 17. He is before all things. He is the eternal, divine, only begotten Son of God. In the beginning, God. And we read in John 1 that in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. He is before all things. Then we saw secondly that he made all things. Verse 16, for by him were all things created. He's before all things. He made all things. The false teachers in Colossae, perhaps not all of them, but many of them, were encouraging worship of angels and all sorts of strange ideas. It's all part of Gnosticism, which we saw weeks ago. And Paul is saying, don't be so foolish as to worship a thing, because he made all things. All things are just creatures, creations. So he is before all things. He made all things. Then we saw that he sustains all things, the end of verse 17, and by him all things consist. He is active in it all. He sustains all things. I don't know if we think about that enough. Well, I don't know why I said I don't know. I do know. We don't think about that enough. You know, he's sustaining everything. And sustaining it without error. And without, I'm trying to get to a word just now. Exertion is the word that's coming to my mind, but that's not quite what I'm trying to get to. But anyway, it'll have to do. You know yourself when you're looking after 2 or 3 things. You got a few things on the go, and it's kind of stressful. And you've got one eye on this and another eye on something else. Imagine sustaining everything. Everything. In land and sea and sky and air. It's beyond. We can grasp, but we can sort of understand the principle anyway. He sustains all things. In him we live and move and have our being. And finally we saw that all things were for him. He's before them, he's made them, he's sustaining them, and they are all for him. Verse 16, all things were created by him and for him. Now this was quite interesting, and I try to expand on this a little bit. Everything was made for him. Everything has a purpose. Through these things that he has made, and he's touched on them in verse 16, hasn't he? He says, whether they be visible or invisible. Well, everything is either one or the other. That's just another way of saying everything. And they were made for him. Through them, he manifests his power. They were made so that he could show his power. They were made so that he could show his wisdom. They were made so that he could execute and accomplish his purposes and plan. The angels were created for that reason. The world was created for that reason. This island we're standing on was created for that reason. Why did he make this island? He made it so that his plans would be accomplished in it. That people on it would come to know him and glorify him in this world and in the world to come. And with that in mind, he made it. He made it for himself. He made it so that he would be glorified in it and by it. And every other inch of land the world over, where his name is glorified. The sheer magnitude of it is breathtaking. So he, through them, through all things that he has made, through them he manifests his power, he demonstrates his wisdom, he executes his plan. All things exist for him. And he also shares them with his church. That's part of the wonder of it as well. I mustn't go down that track just now. But then for his use and for their use as well, at least to an extent. So, Paul is building up a picture in these verses. He's showing the Colossians the supremacy of Christ, lest they downgrade him in any way. He's reminding them of just how glorious he is. He is the Saviour in verse 13, who delivers us from the power of darkness. Well, it's enough in itself, you would say. But he's also the Creator who made all things. But he's now going to show us another aspect of the glory and the supremacy of Christ. Because he's moving on in verse 18 to tell us that he is the head of the church. Now, I want to focus on two things that we find in verse 18 here. First of all, we have a description of Christ, and I was tempted initially to kind of rush through that, because I want to get to the description of the church. But we mustn't really rush through that at all, supposing that's all we achieve tonight. The description of Christ and then a description of the church. And the description of Christ is designed to do exactly what everything he's done so far has done, to show his glory and his supremacy. Now in verse 18, he has two separate descriptions of Christ. Well, he has three really, but one of them is that he is the head of the body, and that's tied up with the description of the church. So we'll just leave that one to one side for a minute. And he is the head of the body, the church. But here's the first description of it. Who is the beginning? The beginning. He is the beginning. I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. He is the beginning. In other words, he has a priority in time, in terms of time, over all else. The phrase can also be translated originator, and that fits in with something that we're going to come to later on. He is the beginning. But then we have another interesting phrase, another interesting description, the firstborn from the dead. And that's just maybe not quite as easy a phrase. firstborn from the dead. It's obviously got something to do with resurrection. Now, he was not the first to rise from the dead. That's obvious. He himself raised other people from the dead. And Lazarus and Jairus' daughter rose before he rose. So he's not the first to rise from the dead. But he was the first to rise from the dead with an incorruptible body. And I think that's really the clue, the key that unlocks it. He was the first raised incorruptible, never to taste death again. You take Lazarus just now. Lazarus was raised from the dead. He lay under the power of death for a time. Where was his soul? Well, we're not told. Probably in the keeping of the angels. But the point that's relevant here is that Lazarus died again. One day, whether it was a year later or 40 years later, one day Lazarus died again. Because Lazarus was only raised in John 10 to his former corruptible state. He was only raised to his former corruptible state. And that corruptible state reached its inevitable terminus on some future day. Christ was not raised. He was raised incorruptible. He was never going to die again. And in that sense, he is the firstborn from the dead. Now, his people, at the resurrection of the dead, they will also rise, not in a corruptible state, but in an incorruptible. 1 Corinthians 15, this corruptible shall put on incorruption. And the body that they rise with will not be subject to corruption or decay, ever, in any facet of it. And that itself is quite remarkable. It's one of the trials of this life. And it's one of the trials even of the Lord's people in this life, the corruptible nature of their body. When the body is slowly breaking down, it's almost breaking down from childhood. But that accelerates, and we see that and we know that. But the resurrection body will not be like that. It will be incorruptible. So he is the firstborn from the dead in that sense. But I think there's more than that here. The phrase also reminds us, and I think it's Hendrickson who insists on this. The phrase also reminds us that Christ rose from the dead, not merely as a private individual, but as a public figure and as a representative. Jairus' daughter rose from the dead, just as Jairus' daughter. There's no significance beyond that, or with Lazarus. But when Christ rose from the dead, he rose as a representative of his people. He is the second Adam. You remember, the first Adam sinned and fell, not just as an individual. He wasn't just the person, the man Adam. He was also the representative and the covenant head of his people. The covenant was made with him on behalf of his descendant. And their future depended on him. and how it fared with him, and it fared badly with him. Adam represents all his people, descended from him by ordinary generation. And Christ too represents all his people. He represents his body. So he died and rose with them symbolically. They are there in his death. They are there symbolically in him and with him in the tomb. And they are there with him symbolically as he rises. He is the firstborn from the dead. And he is the firstborn too, in the sense that without his resurrection, there would be no other resurrection. Every resurrection depends on his resurrection. If Christ be not risen, then is our faith vain, and we are left without hope. The firstborn from the dead. Actually, that there's a strange combination in that phrase. There's birth and death in the one short phrase. Little Wearsby has a helpful comment there. He says, the firstborn from the dead. Christ's tomb was also a womb from which he came out in victory, and from which springs the life of all his people. Christ's tomb was a womb. I am he that liveth and was dead, and I am alive forevermore. And because I live, you shall live also. Because I have defeated death and brought life and immortality to light through the gospel. So we have a description of Christ. It's designed to impress upon them the glory and the supremacy of the Saviour. But then we have a description of the church. Now, the Bible is full of descriptions of the church. There's so many of them. Here's another one. It's not a new one. We've met it in other places. But the church is described as a body. Verse 18. And he is the head of the body, the church. Now, the phrase body is interesting. What does that tell us? It's the church is compared to a body. Well, it tells us at least three things. It tells us, first of all, that it was created. Every body is created. And no body is self-created. Every body owes origin to something else. And the church owes its origin to something else. It isn't something that just sprang up of its own accord. Now, false religions do. They spring up of their own accord. The imagination of some person's heart, and they imagine something, and up springs a false religion or a cult. It originates with themselves. The church is the only, I don't like use of the word religious organization, but you know what I mean. It's the only religious organization in the world, I'm speaking of the Church of Christ here, that didn't spring up out of itself. It's not self-made any more than it's self-sustained. It was made. It was deliberately made. God made humanity, and he made them deliberately, and he designed and shaped them. So the church is neither self-made nor is it accidental. It's deliberate. It's a body. It's fashioned. It's planned. Thought was put into it. Divine thought was put into it. The church is a body. It's created. But it also means that not only is it created, but it means that it's alive. It's also alive. Well, you say not everybody is alive. No. But Christ is the head of the body. And he can only have a living body. It's absurd to think of the head being alive and the body not. So it's created. The church is created. The church is alive. And it will continue to be alive. It will never cease to be alive. Sometimes it may be more lively in certain places and at certain times. But it's just what's seen outward. The church is alive. It's a living organ. And it can never be anything other than a living organ. It's created, it's alive, and it's diverse. It's very diverse. Now, that's not our topic here, and again, I must be careful I don't get drawn into it, but the human body, everything that has a body has many parts, and whether it's a dog or a cat or a human or a fish in the sea or a bird in the air, they're all diverse. They have many different parts. And they have different parts for a reason. Now, the apostle expands on that in 1 Corinthians 12. And he warns against one part of the body looking down on another part. The hand despising the foot or whatever. So this is a description of the church. It is a body. And every Christian is a member of this spiritual body. But crucially in this context, it's a body with a head. And we're told in verse 18 that the head of the body is Christ. Christ is the head of the church. Now, theologians often divide this truth into two parts. They speak of Christ as the organic head of the body and as the ruling head of the body. Now, what does that mean? What's the difference between the two? The organic head of the body, let's take the human. Maybe that's the best way to come at this. Christ is the organic head of the church. In a human body, the head is of crucial importance. It's utterly indispensable. You can do without many parts of your body. And you could lose a limb, several limbs, and function perfectly adequate. If you lose your head, all function ceases instantly. It's utterly indispensable. And in that sense, Christ is utterly indispensable. But that's not what I'm particularly driving at just now. One of its important roles, one of the important roles of the head in the natural human body is in creating and promoting growth and the development of the body. The body promotes growth, the head rather. The head promotes growth and development of the body. I think it's William Hendrickson who develops this particularly. He speaks about the pituitary gland, which is located in a small cavity in the base of the skull. From the pituitary gland comes the growth hormone. And that is all closely related to the development of the body, to the growth of connected tissue and cartilage and bone and so on. So in the human body, growth comes from the head. Development comes from the head. And the same is true as far as the church is concerned. Christ, as the organic head of the church, is the one who brings life and growth and development. We have this explicitly in chapter 2:19. Holding the head, from which all the body, by joints and bands, having nourishment ministered and knit together, increases with the increase of God. That's just saying explicitly what I've been trying to say for the last few minutes. The church is energized by his power. Every single believer receives life and a supply of grace from him. Christ then, as the organic head of his church, directs and creates its character, its size, its shape, and the church is utterly dependent on him for its origin, for its growth, and for the continuance of its life. Dick Lucas puts it like this: if a body does not hold fast to its head, it can hardly hope to survive. So Christ is the organic head of the church. From him, growth and development, size, shape, all comes. He supplies it, he directs it, it is as he wills. He is the organic head of the church. But he is also the ruling head of the church. Now this is easier maybe to understand. He is the ruling head of the church. Not only is he the organic head from which all growth and everything else grows, he is also the ruler. Now again, the human head provides us with good illustration. The brain organizes, guides, and directs the actions of the organs and the limbs. Not only do they owe their life and growth to the head, but the direction, and everything they do is under the power of the head. Indeed, some theologians have actually said, and there's probably mileage in it, that the Lord created the human head and the human body in this way to be an illustration of his own headship in the church. He certainly created marriage to be, amongst other things, an illustration of his connection with the church. And who is to say that this isn't true as well? Anyway, by his word and spirit, he gives direction, he rules his church, he is sovereign in it. The church is to discern his will, to desire his will, to do his will, to discern it, to desire it, and to do it, because he is the head. Just as the head is the center of the body's unity, so Christ is as well. Christ is the head of the church. We're told in Ephesians 1:22 that he is head over all things to the church. He directs all things for their good. And does he not say, all power is given unto me in heaven and earth? So, it is a body. The church is a body. Created and alive. And it's a body with a head. An organic and a ruling head. So, when we put all these verses together, what do we see? We see that Christ is Lord of creation and Lord of the church. He is the directing, controlling authority to which all the limbs must submit. Now, this means that no man on earth is head of the church, whether he be Pope Francis, who claims that, of course, or under Anglicanism, it's King Charles. He would claim to be the head of the Church of England. The Reformed Church in Scotland never accepted that. They said, no, Jesus Christ is King and head of the church. It's there in the Bible. And they were right. But position is reserved exclusively for the Lord Jesus Christ. The false teachers that were going about in Colossae, they were saying, well, Jesus is good. He's one rung on the ladder. And Paul is saying, he's every rung on the ladder. He is the ladder, and he's the only ladder. He's wanting to reassert his supremacy, and we are to guard jealously the headship of Christ. We're to guard it in doctrine, in worship, and in practice. How do we worship, for instance? Are we free to make up our worship as we go along? Or has the head of the church told us how we are to worship? How are we to develop our practice? Are we free to just do whatever seems best to ourselves? Or has the head of the church got something to say about it? Of course he does. Same with doctrine. Personally and corporately, we are to submit to the head. For he is the head of the body of the church, the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. Here's the crucial thing, that in all things, there's his all things again. He's really using this phrase, that in all things he might have the preeminence. And there lies ahead of us in verse 19 another glorious truth, but that will have a wait till another time. We trust the Lord, bless his word for his blessing. Can we take our psalm, sing?